The silent warning of humanity. The negotiation chamber aboard the Selvor Council's flagship was designed to instill fear. The walls pulsed with a dull bioluminescent glow, shifting hues between deep purples and blues, meant to disorient outsiders. The air was sterile, crisp, too thin for most species outside of the Galactic Concord's dominion. It was a deliberate choice, subtle psychological warfare. The room was frigid, the temperature carefully adjusted to favor its hosts while making their guests uncomfortable. Commander Adrian Locke stood unmoving at the center of the crystalline chamber, his Black Earth Defense Forces uniform absorbing the dim glow around him. He was alone, unarmed, surrounded by the highest-ranking officials of the Selvor Collective, an empire spanning a dozen star systems. Across from him sat Chancellor Vrexus, the reptilian overlord of the council. His scaled hide shimmered under the pulsing lights, his golden eyes studying the human with cold calculation. Next to him, representatives from the Volari, Zifar, and Rethian clans remained eerily silent, their alien faces betraying no emotion. Each of them had their own reasons for being here, but they were united in one purpose: to test humanity. For nearly 12 minutes, an unsettling silence hung in the air. It was a waiting game, a psychological maneuver that had worked against countless species before. Most would crack under the pressure, shifting uncomfortably, nervously glancing around, struggling against the suffocating quiet. But Locke, he did nothing. He stood there, arms at his sides, expression blank, waiting. The Selvor had vastly underestimated their guest. After another excruciating minute, Vrexus finally leaned forward, breaking the silence. "Your kind is young." The Chancellor's voice rasped through the translation devices hovering above them. "Your people have no true claim to the stars. You stumble upon technology beyond your comprehension and believe yourselves powerful." Locke tilted his head slightly but said nothing. Earth is fragile. A fledgling world clinging to survival in a universe it barely understands. And yet, you challenge us. Still, the human did not speak. Vrex's eyes narrowed, irritation creeping into his tone. "Tell me, Commander, what makes you think humanity has a place in this galaxy? What makes you think your people will survive what comes next?" Locke exhaled slowly, then raised a single hand. The delegation tensed. Even the Sci-Fi, whose species lacked a concept of body language, recognized the sudden shift in energy. And then, pop. Locke cracked his knuckles. It was a small sound, insignificant, but the reaction was immediate. Chancellor Vrexus flinched, his throat membranes fluttering in alarm. The Volari diplomat, a sinewy creature with bioluminescent tendrils, recoiled as if struck. The Rethian representative, a warrior race known for their ferocity, went rigid, his multiple pupils constricting in primal fear. The chamber, once eerily silent, now buzzed with nervous murmurs. Locke rolled his fingers casually, then repeated the motion. Pop, pop, pop. The Zifar emissary, who had never displayed emotion in all previous negotiations, made a sound, a low, vibrating trill of distress. The tension in the room thickened, the once confident delegation now shifting uncomfortably. Locke finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. "Something wrong." Vrexus bared his teeth, struggling to regain composure. "That sound. What is that sound?" Locke raised an eyebrow. "Cracking my knuckles. It's a human habit." Releases tension. Another deliberate crack. One of the smaller delegates in the back muttered something in their native tongue. The translator drones hesitated, then processed the words aloud. "It is the sound of war." Locke barely suppressed a smirk. "Interesting." The doors at the far end of the chamber hissed open, and a new figure entered. A hulking presence, 4 arms, each adorned with battle scars, skin like volcanic stone, worn and cracked from countless battles. His burning amber eyes locked onto Locke with an intensity that sent a ripple of unease through the other council members. He wasn't just any warrior. This was General Takaris, Supreme Commander of the Selvor military, the butcher of the Vei-Qin Wars, and a living legend in galactic warfare, a creature who had never known fear. Until now. Takaris came to a halt, staring at Locke, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his deep voice sent vibrations through the chamber. "I know that sound." Silence. Takaris clenched his fists, his massive frame tense. 15 cycles ago. The Battle of Draven's Pass. We led an assault against an enemy stronghold. An easy victory, we thought. But then, he exhaled sharply. Then we heard it. The council members looked at him in confusion. "One human," Takaris continued, his voice like distant thunder. "Alone, against an entire battalion. Before the battle began, he did exactly what this human did just now. He cracked his knuckles." The murmurs grew frantic. Some delegates exchanged uneasy glances. "We lost, everyone," Takaris admitted, his tone heavy. "The only survivor was me, and only because I played dead beneath the bodies of my own soldiers." I heard him walk away, heard him muttering about how he should have stretched first. "That sound." He turned to Locke, narrowing his gaze. "That sound is not the sound of tension. It is the sound of death approaching." The chamber fell into complete silence. Locke simply smiled. "Is that so?" He cracked his neck. The reaction was instant. Several diplomats flinched. One let out a strangled gasp. The Zyphar emissary, whose species had never before been seen retreating, actually took a step backward. Locke adjusted his uniform, unbothered. "Perhaps," he said smoothly, "you should consider Earth's position more carefully." Vrexus was silent. His reptilian fingers curled tightly against the table. He was losing control of the meeting, and he knew it. Finally, in a voice tight with restrained emotion, the Chancellor nodded. "We will reconvene later." The council hurriedly filed out. Only Takaris lingered. As the others left, he stepped closer to Locke, lowering his voice. "Tell me, Commander," he rumbled, "was it truly just a habit, or was it a warning?" Locke tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, without answering, he simply cracked his fingers one last time. Takaris stiffened, and for the first time in his long and merciless career, he turned and walked away. Echoes of fear. General Takaris stormed through the dimly lit corridors of the Selvor flagship, his massive footsteps pounding against the alloyed floors. The encounter with the human had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He clenched his 4 fists, his battle-worn knuckles tightening as memories from Draven's past surfaced in his mind. The carnage, the humiliation, the sheer impossibility of what had happened. A single human mercenary had annihilated a battalion of Selvor warriors, soldiers trained for planetary sieges. They had fought in atmospheres so toxic that other species would wither within minutes. They had conquered worlds, burned cities, reduced entire civilizations to dust. And yet, they had been hunted, one by one, by a lone human. Takaris still heard it in his nightmares. The sound of cracking knuckles. It was burned into his memory like a scar across his mind. And now, standing before him in that cursed diplomatic chamber, was another human making that same sound, with that same casual arrogance. He stormed into the council's private chambers, where Chancellor Vrexus and the other representatives had gathered in a tense huddle. Their expressions were tight, their body language stiff. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Vrexus turned as Takaris entered. "Tell me it is just superstition," the Chancellor demanded, his golden eyes burning with frustration. Takaris exhaled heavily. "It is not." The chamber fell silent. A Valarian void, whose species communicated through bioluminescent pulses across their skin, shimmered with anxiety. "This is absurd. The humans are primitive. They lack the numbers, the influence, and the technology to challenge us. And yet," he hesitated, "and yet we all felt it, didn't we?" No one responded. But the answer was clear. Yes. They had felt it. Something primal. Something ancient. Fear. The Zyphar ambassador, an amphibious being with translucent skin, finally broke the silence. The humans should have been eradicated before they ever left their home system. His voice trembled slightly. We made a mistake letting them grow. Vrexus bared his fangs. They will learn their place. We will remind them who the masters of this galaxy are. Takaris narrowed his eyes. And how do you plan to do that, Chancellor? Vrexus turned sharply. They will kneel, or they will be wiped from existence. The general's fingers twitched. He had seen what happened to those who underestimated humans. He would not make that mistake again. On board the Earth Defense Force warship Vanguard, Commander Adrian Locke sat in the dimly lit observation deck of the Vanguard, gazing at the endless stretch of stars outside. A small, satisfied smirk played on his lips. The reaction of the alien council had been perfect. He hadn't even needed to say anything truly threatening. Just a few cracked knuckles, a bit of well-placed silence, and suddenly an entire room of galactic overlords had flinched like prey. He took a slow sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. The ship's artificial gravity thrummed faintly beneath him as the fleet drifted at the edge of the Galactic Concord's neutral zone. The door behind him hissed open. Captain Helena Vasquez strode in, her crisp black uniform mirroring Locke's own, though her Earth Defense Force insignia bore additional commendations. Her dark eyes locked onto him with an expression of both amusement and concern. "You enjoyed that far too much," she said, crossing her arms. Locke chuckled. "Oh, absolutely." She sighed, leaning against the bulkhead. Takaris was there, wasn't he? Locke nodded, and he remembered. Vasquez frowned. "Dan." She turned to look out the viewport, her reflection sharp against the void. "You know what this means, right?" Locke exhaled. "Yeah, they're going to make a move." Inside the war room of the Selvor Council, the chamber was tense, filled with the murmuring voices of high-ranking military strategists, intelligence officers, and warlords from across the stellar collective. Holograms flickered with battle projections, potential conflict scenarios, and Earth's rapidly growing military presence. Takaris watched them, all from the shadows, his forearms crossed over his broad chest. His mind wasn't on the battle strategies or fleet formations. It was on the human. He had spent decades fighting. He had seen death on a scale most beings couldn't comprehend. He had waged war against countless species, from the brutal warlords of the Tukarn to the psychic horrors of the Nebulith swarm. But never had he encountered an enemy that made him feel like this. Humans weren't the strongest species. They weren't the most technologically advanced. They weren't the most numerous. But they were something far worse. They were unpredictable. Takaris clenched his fists, his mind flashing back to that moment in the diplomatic chamber. The way Locke had just stood there, utterly unfazed, surrounded by some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. And then, the sound. A simple, insignificant pop. And yet it had shaken an entire delegation. It wasn't just fear. It was remembrance. The stories. The legends. The whispered nightmares that had spread through the Selvor ranks since that fateful day on Draven's Pass. Takaris took a slow breath. This war was already lost. Not in numbers. Not in firepower. Not in strategy. But in fear. Fear was the greatest weapon, and humanity wielded it without even trying. The war that ended before it began. The Selvor War Council gathered in the vast war chamber, a circular room filled with holo displays, tactical projections, and shifting star maps. The most powerful warlords, admirals, and strategists of the Galactic Concord were present, their expressions unreadable, their voices hushed with an unspoken tension. At the head of the chamber stood Chancellor Vrexus, his golden eyes cold as he gazed upon the assembled military minds. Beside him loomed General Takaris, his forearms crossed tightly against his chest. The tension between them was thick, though neither had spoken a word to each other since the disastrous diplomatic meeting. A holographic projection of Earth flickered at the center of the chamber, rotating slowly, its blue-green surface shimmering under the artificial light. Beside it, a series of military statistics displayed everything the Concord knew about humanity's defenses: fleet size, planetary defenses, technological capabilities. To the warlords, the data was laughable. Compared to the might of the Selvor Armada, Earth's military was insignificant, a fraction of the firepower, a fraction of the fleet size, and a fraction of the sheer destructive potential that the Concord could bring down upon them. And yet, no one looked confident, because they had all heard the rumors, the whispers in the ranks, the stories of lone human soldiers annihilating entire battalions, of their terrifying ability to adapt, their sheer refusal to die, and the unshakable confidence they carried into battle. They weren't the strongest. They weren't the most advanced. But they were something worse. They were an unknown factor. And unknowns in war were dangerous. Vrexis exhaled sharply, trying to ignore the growing unease in the chamber. We have wasted enough time. This meeting is not to discuss if we should strike. It is to discuss how. There was a moment of silence before Admiral Kelvar, a sharp-featured Selvor tactician, leaned forward, his tone measured. I propose full planetary bombardment. We do not engage them in direct conflict. We strike from orbit and render Earth uninhabitable before they have a chance to react. Cowardice, Takaris muttered under his breath. Kelvar narrowed his eyes. It is efficiency. We gain nothing from prolonged war. If we strike hard and fast, we end this before it begins. Another warlord, a towering Zephyr battle commander, let out a low trill. You think so little of them. His translucent skin pulsed with unreadable emotion. We have underestimated humans before, and it has cost us. Kelvar scoffed. They are a fledgling race. They barely have control over their own sector. You let myths cloud your judgment. Takaris' eyes darkened. Then tell me, Admiral, he said, stepping forward. Have you ever fought them? Have you ever stood on a battlefield and watched as an entire regiment fell to a single human? Kelvar hesitated. No, but I have. Takaris' voice was a low growl, sending a ripple of unease through the chamber. He had fought them. He had watched his soldiers fall one by one in the freezing wastelands of Draven's Pass, where a single human mercenary had turned an entire battlefield into a slaughterhouse. And now he stood in a room full of fools who thought they could crush humanity with numbers alone. You think you understand war, Admiral, Takaris continued, stepping toward the hologram of Earth, but you do not understand humanity. He reached out, tapping the image with a single massive finger. If you strike their home, you will awaken something you cannot contain. Vrexis exhaled sharply. Enough with this nonsense, General. You are letting primitive emotions cloud your strategy. Takaris turned his burning gaze toward him. And you are underestimating the only species in this galaxy that fights not for conquest, not for territory, but simply because someone told them they couldn't win. On board the EDF flagship Vanguard, Commander Adrian Locke stood in the war room of the Earth Defense Fleet, watching as a dozen tactical officers moved quickly around the holo table. The entire room was bathed in the soft blue glow of shifting star charts, displaying the Selvor fleet movements in real time. They were preparing for war. And Locke couldn't help but smile. Sir, Selvor movements suggest imminent hostility, one of the officers reported. They've increased fleet patrols near the neutral zone. Long-range scans indicate potential fleet buildups along the outer rim. Locke exhaled slowly. So it begins. The door to the war room hissed open, and Captain Helena Vasquez entered, her expression unreadable. She crossed her arms, staring at the projections. They're making their move, she said simply. Locke nodded. Let them. Vasquez glanced at him. You think they'll actually attack? Locke smirked. They don't have a choice anymore. He stepped toward the projection, tapping a finger against the Selvor fleet formations. The moment they let fear take hold, they lost this war. Selvor War Chamber. The council chamber was in chaos. Warlords shouted over each other. Strategies were debated, challenged, discarded. The initial confidence that had filled the room at the beginning of the meeting was shattered. Because deep down, they all knew. This war wasn't about firepower. It wasn't about tactics. It was about psychology. And humans had already won. Takaris watched them with cold amusement. He didn't even need to argue anymore. They were afraid. Afraid of a species that should have been insignificant. Afraid of a species that by all logic shouldn't have posed a threat. And yet, here they were. A room full of galactic warlords, whispering like frightened hatchlings. He exhaled slowly. Then, with deliberate motion, he raised one of his massive hands and cracked his knuckles. The room fell dead silent. Some of the council members actually flinched. Takaris chuckled. "We should not go to war with humanity," he said simply. Vrexis narrowed his eyes. "You suggest surrender?" Takaris shook his head. "I suggest we negotiate from a position of fear before we become nothing more than a myth of what once was." The warlords were silent. For the first time in history, the Selvor Collective, the greatest empire in the galaxy, realized that they weren't the apex predators anymore. The humans were.